Hello and welcome to another in our series of EU Reporter discussion programmes brought to you in partnership with Human Rights Without Frontiers. Today we're looking at the religious persecution of China, especially a relatively new religious movement known as the Church of Almighty God, or Eastern Lightning, founded in 1991. Recently, China has been under great scrutiny from the international community regarding human rights abuses, from the death of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang being denied basic human rights. But all religious groups suffer persecution in China. Practically all religions which do not align themselves with the Chinese government and the Communist Party are deemed illegal, a problem we'll be discussing a little bit later. But we start today with Tomasz Zdrowski, a member of the European Parliament, a Christian Democrat from the Czech Republic, who sits in the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee, and who's also a member of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China. So, first of all, Mr. Zdrowski, how are the members of this church being persecuted? What is actually happening in China?
Now in China is very prohibited to any religious behavior. Also, if you are a member of official China church, you can really sometimes practice your religion. But in general, there is the problem that the secret police every time control all religious organization, and they have it fear to openly practice their religion and to be involved in some movement or in some institution what are prohibited from the Chinese government.
Of course, as far as the Roman Catholics are concerned, for instance, there are those who practice according to the Chinese law, which means that they acknowledge Beijing as being in charge of the church, and there are those who are still see the Pope as the leader of their church, but they're divided, aren't they? I mean, that's illegal.
They're divided, and now there are two churches. One is the secret church that are people practicing. This is the same situation like was in Czechoslovakia until 1989, and they are two churches. One is official under the official control, and one is unofficial, and this unofficial has really strong relationship with Vatican and with other Catholic church around the world.
Do you think that the position of the members of the Church of Almighty God is any worse than, for instance, the Uighur Muslims?
Absolutely, absolutely, because I think they are the biggest enemy of the regime. An enemy is every time control this organization and really stalk all the people from this community. Also, they are in horrible situation. I met some of them, and they explained me how was it horrible in prison, and how was it really, how many people are still in prison or in some labor camps. Also, it's absolutely amazing situation, and nobody can imagine how horrible the situation they are.
Because there are still members of the Falun Gong who are in prison too, something like 2,000 held in prison, and they were seen as the Communist Party's biggest enemies. They were the people they were most clamping down on, and the Church of Almighty God seems to have taken their place.
Yeah, about the Falun Gong and our other religion movement, we had here 2 years or 3 years ago really very huge written declaration about organ harvesting, and they are facing this practicism, and there exist many books and many really investigation about these cases, because really if somebody from the religious groups is in the prison or in the working camp, there is huge problems that really they have it two possibilities: to stay in prison or to give one of organ and go out from the prison or from these working camps, and it's absolutely horrible.
I mean, I had a friend who was a member of the Falun Gong who talked about organ harvesting. Is that also happening with people from the Church of Almighty God?
Yes. With this church, with Catholic Church, and with other organizations, with some Muslims, they have had this same experience. It's not only about the Falun Gong or Catholic. It's all the religious groups.
Because the media has been full of stories about the Uighur and these education camps, as China calls them, where people are learning to be bakers and tilers and things like this. But no one seems to be talking about the persecution of the Church of Almighty God. Why is that?
I think because they are small groups and they don't have so many lobbyists like other organizations. They are really much more focused for the China and South Asia, and they are not so present in the European, and they are not so strong to really present the stories. Also, I think that they need in the future to be better organized and to focus their cases to the media.
They haven't been very successful in applying for political asylum or asylum of any sort in another country, have they? Canada's been quite kind to them. I think Italy and Germany have been, but basically there's only been one application in Britain and that was rejected. But it's not surprising. But they don't seem to have much luck in getting elsewhere to be safe.
Yes. We had a lot of application in the Czech Republic too, and there was the success that half of them they have it the refugee status, and some of them they don't have it. For some, I don't know for which reason, but I think that really we can see that this group. We don't have a lot of information about the situation in China, and this is why the British officers said that we don't know nothing about the persecution of these people, and we have to much more focus for these groups and really explain to people that they are in the dangers in their country, because we know that Catholics are in the dangers, we know that Falun Gongs are in the dangers, we know that some of Muslim communities are in the China in the danger, but nobody knows about this special community of Christians, what is really very strong and what is really much more focused for this part of the world, because nobody knows there, and there are not so many practicing people from the European community what wants to support this community from the China.
Is there more that the EU could be doing, should be doing in this case? I mean, as far as I know, we're not even talking about it here, are we?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that if we have the stronger politicians, this is not only about the politicians, because China respects only the politicians who are strong. They don't respect nobody who is saying blah 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 about economic things. We have to need very good relation with China. But if you are focused for human rights and you will criticize it, then China respects you much more. I will give you one very good example. We have two countries. The Greece, who really is focused for Chinese money, because there is a lot of Chinese investment. But they never criticize the China officials. And then you have Italy, who is much more focused for human rights, because there is the Vatican and Catholic Church is very strong. And they criticize many times the China. And the relationship between Italy and China is now much more stronger like before. Also, it shows that China needs really this dialogue, and we have to say what is not really positive for us. If we will not say nothing about Tibet, if we will respect all this education camp, this is the same like Nazis, the concentration camp. There is not any difference, and we have to mention it. And this is the same systems that we will lose our principle of democracy.
Chinese authorities estimate that the Church of Almighty God has up to 4 million followers. That's probably an exaggeration, but another Christian missionary organization reckons that it has more than 1 million members. Fear of government persecution has driven religious groups in China underground, making an accurate head count of any group's followers virtually impossible. It's estimated that 1 million Uighur Muslims have been put into compulsory re-education camps. Christian and Buddhist places of worship have been closed. Human Rights Without Frontiers has documented more than 2,000 cases of Falun Gong prisoners and more than 1,200 from the Church of Almighty God. Many of them, it's alleged, facing torture, and those numbers could well be underestimates. The Church of Almighty God is now said to be the most persecuted religious movement in China and to have replaced Falun Gong as the main target of religious persecution. With me to discuss the issue, I have Dr. Zsuzsa Ann-Ferenczi, who has been working as a political advisor at the European Parliament since 2008, focusing on foreign affairs and global human rights. Her field of expertise includes Asia, especially the Korean Peninsula, India and Nepal, and especially China. She's worked closely on the situation of religious and ethnic minorities living in and outside China with a view to protecting their right to education in their mother tongue and other issues of freedom, self-governance, self-expression and rights. She's conducted academic research and interviews on EU-China relations. I'm also joined by Leah Pericrests and by Willy Fautre, both from Human Rights Without Frontiers, which in September published 2 reports on the Church of Almighty God, which is severely repressed in China. They were presented at the annual OSCE meeting on human rights in Warsaw in September and for the UN Universal Periodic Review in Geneva earlier this month. Leah Pericrests, you've been looking at the sort of situation of religious persecution in China. What is actually happening with the Church of Almighty God and why are we hearing more about it?
So in China, the Chinese Communist Party is officially an atheist party. So that means that any religious group that does not officially align itself with the party is seen as basically illegal or seen as an enemy or a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So as a result, what we are seeing across China is discrimination and persecution of religious people. This includes, of course, the Church of Almighty God. The most common feature of this persecution across the board for all religious groups is being imprisoned because of your religion. At Human Rights Without Frontiers, we keep a database of prisoners, and we have over 3,000 documented cases in China, and that is a far underestimation because, of course, it's hard to get the resources that we need from inside China about individual cases. So we've documented 3,000 individuals. We have their names, where they were arrested, when they were arrested, their charges, their prison sentence, and sometimes as well which prison they're being kept in.
And presumably in prison they're not being treated terribly well. I mean, Chinese prisons aren't known for being kind to people.
Exactly. So when we have had the chance to gather testimonies from people who have been in prison, torture remains a dominant trend amongst all of these individuals. They often face physical torture as well as mental torture, and many times we see that officials are trying to get them to renounce their faith as a result of the torture.
And Willie, I mean, your organisation has been trying to document this, but in fact, a lot of people have heard about the Uyghurs and heard about the Falun Gong, but very few people have heard about the Church of Almighty God, and yet it's been running since 1991.
Yeah. Since then, they've been heavily persecuted, and as my colleague Leah told you, we cover all religious groups, Uyghurs, Catholics, Protestants, and so on. And that church is, I would say, rooted in Protestantism in a sense, although it has its own theology. But a few years after it was created in China, it was officially banned. And being banned means that if you have any activity, even in private houses, you are persecuted. And the problem is that they are so heavily persecuted that they are sent to prison for 3 to 7 years if they just carry some literature of their own faith, or if they meet in a private house, or if they talk about their faith to other people. So a number of them have suffered so much that they have left the country. They've gone to South Korea. There are about 700 and even more, I think, that are still waiting to get a political asylum and have not managed to get the status, but also in Europe. And that's because we in the EU are concerned about this situation, that we wanted to raise that sort of persecution about that specific group. In Belgium, there are a dozen of them that are waiting. They have their lawyers. In France, more than 400. Just a few of them got political asylum. The others must hide because if they are controlled by the police on the street, they would be put in a detention center before being deported. And being deported is the worst that could happen to them because it would mean to give them back in the hands of their persecutors. We had 2 cases quite recently. We had someone from Germany that was sent back at the end of August. Another one from Switzerland, that's a woman. When she arrived in China, she immediately went into hiding. I would say she didn't want to go back to her home because it was under surveillance. Despite that, she was arrested and she was put in administrative detention for 2 weeks. But afterwards, it was prolonged by 3.5 years. So she will be there in prison until the end of 2020. Another case from South Korea, someone who had some health problems and because of the illegal situation could not get at all medical assistance, decided to go back to China and was arrested when he arrived, although he also went into hiding. And then he was put for 2 months in a so-called re-education camp, like the Uyghurs, where they were pushing him to recount his faith, but also to give information about other members of the church, which that person refused to do. And then he or she was released, whether it is this particular case, but there are also many other cases. They are kept under surveillance all the time.
Dr. Zsuzsa Anna Ferenczi, is there more that the EU could be doing about this? Because there doesn't seem to be much awareness about the problem.
Yeah, I think your question goes into the right direction. What is it that we could do more? But when we look at that question, I think it's very important to make a few points. Number 1 point I would make is that EU-China relations, if we try to assess what the EU has been doing and can do, it's important to point out that there's a fundamental normative divergence between the 2 sides. So when it comes to human rights, the interpretation and the application of the concept is very different on the 2 sides. So when we look at the EU, we see that the EU promotes human rights as universal values, where political and cultural rights go hand in hand with economic and social rights, so there's no prioritization. And this has been at the core of the EU's foreign policy when it comes to third countries. Of course, how the EU has managed to do this so far, to promote it effectively, is where your question is right, because we see that there has been a lot of criticism because the EU, as an international organization, this is important to point out because it's not a country we're dealing with. There's many different countries within, which has often limited the way the EU has been able to deal with China. And this is when I come to look at China as a country that has gone through a remarkable growth in the past 4 decades with really economically speaking, economic regional influence, translating that into political influence. So we're dealing with a very important and strategic partner for us. But when it comes to human rights, the divergence is very visible. So China, even though in the narrative they embraced the concept of human rights as universal values, but in practice we see that they much more are in favor of a relativist approach and a state-centric approach to human rights, where the individual is taken out of the discourse on human rights. So we've seen that in the latest UN Human Rights Council resolution that China put forward with the title of Promoting Mutually Beneficial Cooperation in the Field of Human Rights. So the idea is to have a mutually beneficial cooperation among states to promote human rights. So you see the individual is taken out of the context, and the idea is to build a community of shared future for humanity. So this is the discourse that China uses when they talk about human rights, as opposed to the discourse we have in Europe when we talk about human rights, rule of law, and democracy as mutually reinforcing principles that are at the core of foreign policy. So you see human rights foreign policy diverge greatly. So what we can do when we face such limitations, given that we are not a country but an organization of 28 countries, it is very difficult. What we can do is probably to continue shaping discourse as we have done, I think, in the international community. But in the face of Chinese growing capacity to shape discourse on their end, the challenges are growing.
I mean, as far as most people who are not followers of any religion in China are concerned, I mean, they do have a certain degree of freedom. We see a lot of Chinese tourists, after all, in Europe. Presumably they're allowed to travel, although these days I gather they have to prove their civic worth before they can buy a rail ticket or a plane ticket. But I met somebody, a Chinese citizen, working for the Council of Europe in Dublin when I was over there a couple of years ago. So he was able to, he was going home for his, for his birthday. But followers of religion have a problem, don't they? Because China is an atheist state, officially an atheist state.
Indeed, as Leah was saying, it is an atheist state where freedom of religion is not a freedom guaranteed to the individual, and this goes back to the short description of the approach to human rights that I gave earlier, and it also links to the fact that economic rights before political rights. This is the officially upheld approach of the Chinese Communist government, where people can enjoy economic benefits because this is the result of Chinese remarkable growth, and we have to give credit to that because, as they like to say, and I think rightfully so, 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty. So there's a lot of development that China has achieved and ensured to their citizens, but political rights are where there is criticism from a Western perspective. But I think that's also a very important point when we analyze a country's political or cultural, when we analyze a country's political culture, because perceptions and history really shapes perceptions. So we always talk about China as we sit here, a very important debate, but we always talk about China from a Western perspective, and we also need to be mindful of how, as I said, things are seen and perceived differently, and that has a very big impact on how we assess things. Nevertheless, you know, there's certain basic concepts where I'm sure we cannot disagree, which is human dignity being the core of human rights. So I think no matter what culture you live in, you know, ensuring that human dignity of the individual and the community, if you don't want to talk about the individual but the community, I think the human dignity is a core concept we can agree.
China is quite sensitive to criticism, though, isn't it? Leah, if I come to you on this one, they don't like criticism. They describe the criticism of their treatment of the Uyghurs as criticised by 14 countries, and they said it was just rude, which is a very odd way to describe a hostile reaction. They don't take criticism easily, do they?
No, but as Suzu was saying, it's a culturally sensitive discussion that we're having with China. You know, we have to meet them halfway as far as the language that we use when we criticize them or when we compliment them for any improvement that they've made. It's all about the language that we use and the way in which we do it. And I think if we are to further understand, as Suzu was saying, how we conceptualize human rights and to know how they're going to receive it is of utmost importance when we do bring up these issues.
I think we need to develop a better capacity to be able to look at the world through their eyes, because that's the only way we can understand how they reach out and how they relate to the world. And I think that goes for any culture, and it goes for any relationship that we develop. Nevertheless, we also need to keep in mind the fact that China, as I said, has gone through this remarkable development, and they uphold the right that every country has the right to develop in the way that their own domestic conditions require them to develop. So they uphold that right, and that's sovereignty. And that's also a very important concept, the respect of sovereignty and no interference in other countries' domestic affair. And human rights falls in the same direction, in the same category, that whenever the West criticizes the Chinese government for their treatment of human rights, they reject that criticism by saying that it is our domestic affair. So we need to be more mindful of how the Chinese government has reached this point where they have become really a global power with global influence, and I think they are an essential partner for the international community to be able to meet the challenges that we're facing. And I think this is a very positive development that China has already taken on board some of the commitments that they have signed up to when it comes to protection of the environment. Of course, this is an issue that is very important for China's domestic development, so they need to work on the environment because the growth they have gone through, has deteriorated the environment so much that it now puts at risk all the achievements. So, but then if we look at the UN and then peacekeeping operations, we see that China is the largest contributor of military and civilian troops to the UN peacekeeping operations among the UN Security Council members.
In September, there was that meeting at the OSCE in Warsaw, and we decided to approach the participating states of this OSCE with this problem of deportation of those members of the Church of Almighty God. So we decided to have a soft approach, a friendly approach based on dialogue. And we went to the delegations, we explained them what was the situation of that group in China, how they were persecuted, and they should be granted asylum in our countries and not to be deported and put back in the hands of their persecutors.
Meanwhile, I think the important thing is to actually just talk about it. But anyway, we've run out of time for today.
Yes.
We've talked enough. So my thanks to all of their guests today, Dr. Zsuzsa Anna Ferenczi, Willy Foltre and Leah Pericrest. If you'd like to support the work of Human Rights Without Frontiers, then you can make a donation via PayPal or by bank transfer, the details of which are now appearing on your screen. But that's it for this time. We'll be back in a month's time talking about another global human rights issue. Join us then. For now, though, goodbye.